Good evening, I'm Ernie Manouse. Tonight we welcome you into a conversation on race, Houston, civil rights, and the 1960s. Throughout the month of May, Houston PBS has aired a series of programs, both local and national, looking at the civil rights movement, from Jim Crow to Martin Luther King, from the Reconstruction era to the Freedom Rides. But tonight our focus comes closer to home. Through questions and conversation, we'll explore how our city handled this turbulent time in U.S. history. To navigate these issues with us, we've brought together a group of community leaders, scholars, and activists, and invited them to join in our frank discussion on race. Our panel consists of Reverend William A. Lawson, civil rights leader and the official spokesperson for the Freedom Now Project; Eddie Rigsby Hamilton, civil rights activist who took part in the 1960s demonstrations; Otis King, civil rights activist, also a participant in the 1960s demonstrations and past dean of Texas Southern University's Thurgood Marshall School of Law; Cherry Steinwender, co-executive director, the Center for the Healing of Racism; Derek Mohammed, Houston-based activist and community organizer; and Dr. Tyrone Tillery, professor, University of Houston, specializing in civil rights history. Now, for the full bios on all of our panel, please visit houstonpbs.org/ACO race. And now we begin. Our first question will go out to Derek Mohammed. My first question is understanding how the community today views the civil rights movement of the 60s. We're 50 years from it now. How do you hear people talking about it and remembering it?
Well, let me first say thank you, Ernie, and to Channel 8 for inviting me today, and it's a pleasure and an honor and a privilege to be up here with such stalwarts of the civil rights movement in the black community. I was born in 1971, so one could probably call me a post-civil rights or a post-segregation child. So I was born into integration. However, if my memory recalls me correctly, I never had a conversation with a Caucasian person until I was probably 17 years old or so. So to be very honest with you, I did not hear much about the civil rights movement growing up. But as I got older and I began to study myself, my history, my past, and my ancestry, then I began to learn more about it. And where we are today, where the civil rights movement is concerned, I believe is we have a great respect. We have great adulation for those who fought, bled, and died for us during that time period. However, there's not as much footage of the marches and the dogs being sicked on the elderly from Houston as there is in, say, Alabama or even Harlem, per se. So the history is sort of obscure. That doesn't mean that it did not take place, but I believe that it needs to be better documented, which I believe is the reason for a program like this.
Let me jump in here for a second and say, Dr. Tillery, do you notice the same reaction from students that you deal with looking back at that period in Houston's history?
Well, I think that certainly on the college level, students are aware of the civil rights movement in Houston. They are aware of the history, in fact, of civil rights in Houston going all the way back to slavery. I mean, that is one of the things that we do at the university. They are aware clearly, I mean, one of the most important topics that we talk about in the 60s is the unique civil rights movement in Houston. Because even though we don't have pictures of the dogs and the kinds of beatings that took place in some of the other places, it was nonetheless, I think Houston's civil rights movement is nonetheless very unique, but also faced many of the same challenges and the same dangers that occurred in Birmingham and other places.
Mr. King, let me ask you, being there at the time, involved with the movement, what was your recollection of that period?
it was kind of faint at one time, and then more recently it's become strong again, as we've been discussing it the last few weeks. It was a time when we were really just filled with joy and pride at being able to attack the system of segregation. It gave us an opportunity to step out and actually do something rather than just sitting around talking about it and saying how awful it was. So those of us who had the opportunity to participate feel very good about it. I agree with what was said earlier, that it has been sort of forgotten to a certain extent here in Houston because it wasn't as horrendous as in some of the other places. And programs like this and the other things that we participated in over the last couple of weeks are very good to bring it back to mind, because I believe we can drift away from the accomplishments we've made. We can forget what things were like and fail to realize how far we've come from those days.
Yeah. Reverend Lawson, take me back to those days. What was it like and what was going on that led to the beginning of this movement?
Well, the interesting thing is that in Houston, the civil rights movement began with students, and the same thing is true nationwide. It didn't begin with adults concerned about segregation. It began with students who were determined no longer to let this happen to them. So students in Washington and in Greensboro, North Carolina, boarded buses and decided that they were going to test a law. The Interstate Commerce Commission and the Supreme Court had decreed interstate segregation unlawful, and they wanted to see whether it really was unlawful. So when you talked about the dogs and the hoses and all those sorts of things, these were freedom riders who were being attacked. And in Houston, as we looked at what was happening nationwide, these students, and I have to give them credit for a whole lot of guts, but these students decided that the people from North Carolina were right, and that we should be doing the same thing. So our attack against segregation in Houston started at least because it was inspired by movements like this from students with passion in other places.
Ms. Hamilton, let me ask you, the Freedom Rides, if I understand it, began about 1961, but there were
Correct.
already the sit-ins happening, and there was a sit-in here before that even. And so the movement had begun earlier in Houston.
It had a group of us on campus of Texas Southern, with the encouragement of one of our students who isn't here today, who was in law school, and I don't know how I really got the call to be there, but for some reason I kind of migrated or gravitated toward this individual who was Elgery Stern. And yes, I was already fired up anyway from having spent a year or so outside of Texas, where I was told that you can't do thus and so, even though you qualify for this. I was also one who had heard of all of the things happening. So I was just at the point where I was just full of everything and ready to explode. And instead of it being explosive, I'm a very passionate person deep within. We began to, as we would meet and talk with this in the surroundings and apartment, started off with this person, Elgery, and I guess there were about 10 or 12 others of us, began to put a framework together that was not solidly in place in terms of great organization. We were loosely organized. It was like sitting around discussing, what do you think we ought to do? How do you think we ought to go about doing it? And the biggest thing, the most important thing that we held kept sight of was that Martin Luther King, in terms of being peaceful in our groups and our marches and whatever it was that we did. So that just set right well with me. Not that I feared getting out and being on the forefront, but from that time on, and then having lived in Houston and most of my schooling here except the very early years, maybe 1 or 2 years done elsewhere, made me ready. The fire was in my soul, in my heart.
Yeah.
So I exploded.
Cherry, let me ask you, just to put point of reference in, we always think of Martin Luther King and the 60s. How early were people aware of what Martin Luther King was doing? How early had he made an impact on this whole movement?
It's very interesting when you look back. And in doing so, is that there were fiery sermons being preached within the church before they ever got out into the street. And so when we look at it that way, probably every part of his being was preparing him for what we hear and what we talk about all the time. And so when we look back, I feel very honored to be in the presence of each one of you as you were talking in the green room. And the reason that I want to give you thanks for that, because I didn't arrive in Houston until 1961. And right after that, I gave birth to a child who lived only 5 years, and he died of leukemia. So I could only watch what you were doing to the limited amount of footage that we were really shown. However, I did go to Walgreens to shop, and there were no seats there because they had pulled up all of the benches to keep you from sitting down. So I was able to do that. But that's something very interesting that's very powerful for me as I look at you, as I listen to you. And that is, how has it shaped Cherry? I think that's what's important, how it shaped Cherry. And one of the things I know, right after 1968, when my baby died, I made it my business to go into almost every one of these white establishments that I could. And 99% of the time, I was the only black person there. But I did it because I knew people died for my right to be there. And I really didn't care if you didn't want me there. I will take your abuse. I will do whatever, but I will stay there. And that's how you shaped me. Maybe I didn't take part in the times with you. I didn't march with you then. But I am leading a march now. And I'm going to see it through to the end. That's how it has shaped me.
Let me go over to Dr. Tillery.
Just this point about the lack of footage and coverage, that actually was to some extent by design. If you look at the civil rights movement in Houston, particularly when these young students were demonstrating, that there were agreements made between the black establishment and the white power elite that if they were going to desegregate, they had a certain way of doing it, and one of them was to make sure that there were blackouts in the news. Right. And so you wouldn't get footage because the newspapers actually, they were mum. I mean, they were quiet. I mean, that was a part of the arrangement that they made. So I think that accounts for why we don't have as much footage as we would have. But that was what they worked out to achieve integration to some extent in Houston.
To explain a little further to our audience, the fact was that they were going to desegregate some of the lunch counters downtown, and to do that, the decision was made by the power brokers of the day. Let's not have it on camera, let's not show it on the news, because that could incite riots. If we just do it, we can slide it in and be done with it. If we have the footage, then picketers might come and riots and violence and all of that could happen. Mr. Muhammad, hold 1 second, let me go over to Mr. Muhammad, and then we'll come over here.
Yes, very quickly. I would like to say that even though there may not be much video footage per se, just because I did not know what took place in Houston during the civil rights era, I was taught about what took place nationally in school. And I think that if we wish to properly preserve the history of the struggle in our community in this city, somebody needs to make sure that there's a working document, particularly while these beautiful brothers and sisters are still with us. We have to make sure that that history is preserved so that we might teach young brothers and sisters in the community what happened here in Houston, because most of them do not know.
Mm-hmm. But we do have a movie, mm-hmm. The Strange Demise of Jim Crow, which really is an excellent documentary, and it really, I think, it explores the entire, I think, sit-in movement and the freedom riot movement in Houston. I think it's a great step. We have a lot of people in there who were active in the demonstration, who are on the stage today.
What you're talking about, also the strange demise of Jim Crow and the Freedom Riders documentary, if you go to our website, we'll be listing when those will be airing again, because they did air in the past month, and we're kind of at the end of the train here, so to let people know that happen to miss those programs.
And you did an excellent job of that, by the way.
Well, thank you, but it was
last week.
Actually, it's the excellent job that you up on the panel did that gave us the footage to be able to do this. So thank you for all the work that you folks did in sacrificing all you did.
Really, Ernie, been able to, I taped some of these to later look at, but let me share with you the 60s prior, before the Freedom Riders came through. Kind of tell you what.
And I'm going to stop you right here just to ask you a question on that. When you say when the Freedom Riders came through, from the civil rights movement point of view, was that a pivotal moment in this movement, or was it just one more event in a larger picture?
For me personally, it was one more event in a larger picture, because it brought to Houston something that we had not experienced and dealt with. And let me give you the irony of what it was for me. It was ironical, irony in a sense, because I had been sent to be, I think I shared with others, a choice of going to Shell Oil Company or to the Houston Police Department. Well, they courted me from the Houston Police Department to join that, because that had been a force where it had been so racist, so segregated, that I think they tried to select the personalities to match with the jobs, the various jobs that they were sending us out to do. So it was a little difficult for me to be there at the police department and carry on what I was doing. And then when the Freedom Riders, I learned of them being incarcerated, those who came down through the Union Station. I wasn't active physically in it, but I never lost sight of what was going on. And so the fight, again, it stove the fire within me, and I wasn't too popular. At the police department or any place else, I was always known as the person who talked too much.
I wonder why.
Reverend Lawson, let me ask you this.
Yes.
When we look back at it, and I mean no disrespect when I ask the question, but I think there is a lack of true understanding of what segregation felt like at the time. We know the word, we've seen the films, we hear the stories, but the way it attacked a person as an individual to live in that system, can you express feelings or thoughts about that?
Two things fairly quickly. I still am in awe of people like Dean King. He is right now a scholar, a professor in a law school. As you mentioned already, he's been former dean of that law school. As you didn't mention, but it is true that he was also the former city attorney of Houston. And when you consider that and the fact that in those days of segregation, it was completely unthinkable that these young people should oppose the traditions of segregation and be jailed, and yet somehow end up without a jail record so that he could be where he is. Otherwise, he couldn't even have been a teacher, much less a dean or city attorney. Segregation in those days had two effects. One of those effects was that it was a painful insult to us. We could go into Foley's, but we couldn't try on shoes. We could eat in the back of a restaurant, but couldn't go in the front door. That's the bad part of segregation. The good part was that our neighborhoods were not split up; they were all together, and so we grew up in villages where we were taught to be proud of ourselves. Sometimes by people who themselves didn't have education, but who did have wisdom and character, and they passed that on down to us. When we desegregated, then the cream of our crop split up and left us, and they went to the suburbs, and so the inner city didn't have that treasury of wealth, of character and of wisdom. So those two effects I see.
I want to go to Dean King first, and then I'm going to go over to you.
It was interesting as I listened to Reverend Lawson talk about my being city attorney, the first black city attorney, I think is normally the way it's put. As I sat there on the 4th floor of City Hall, and I would think about the times when I could come downtown and probably in City Hall would have had trouble finding a water fountain. I thought about the silent insults that I had suffered growing up, just having to move to the back of the bus, those kind of things. And I was happy that my children and grandchildren never experienced that, but they need to know about it. Mm-hmm. The old saying about if you don't know where you've been, how you going to know where you're going?
Right.
And as I sat there in City Hall, I asked a photographer friend of mine, Virgil Bennett, to go out to 5th Ward, go on Lyons Avenue and take pictures of 2 Jesse Dale shotgun houses and have it framed for me. And I put it on my wall at City Hall because I never wanted to forget where I had come. And I think that these discussions, particularly with the younger people who've never experienced this, and then a lot of us don't talk about it. We don't talk about it around our kids that much anymore, about how things used to be.
But see, that's the thing. I want to get a good understanding, a snapshot of in the time. We're talking about then when you were city attorney looking back, but when you were actually in a segregated city, living that way. What did it do to you on a day? Were you actually aware in that way, or was it just the way of life?
Well, you didn't come up against it all the time, every day, particularly once, let's say I was in college. I would ride the bus to school. I may or may not think about the fact that I had to sit behind a particular line of demarcation. While you're in school around your friends, you know that you're in a totally black institution, but it's not really on your mind. You don't think about it. It's only when you have an incident, such as Stearns was beaten by the police, and that propelled him to want to do something about all of the things that were going in Houston. I mean, you feel the silent insults of what is taking place. I mean, as you walk about, as you look about. But at least for me, it wasn't something that was on my mind as a burning issue every day. But when you did come up against something, you did think about it.
Does that insult that's going on bring you closer together as a community, or does it tear at you as a person to make you feel less than?
I think it brought us closer together as a community. And I think that because we sort of suffered in a kind of collective way, that your next door neighbor had to go through the same things that you went through. And I think we were closer and tighter knit, as Reverend Lawson has said, as a community during that time, because we were forced into certain areas. And as a result of that, we did, I believe, we were a little more united in that regard.
Eddie, I'll get you in 1 second, but I did promise Derek I would go over that.
Yes, I believe that the jewel of segregation was that, as Brother King said, it forced us to become more united, closer and close-knit as a community and as a people. When I was growing up in the 70s, I remember going to church in 4th Ward, which was once called Freedmanstown, and I remember seeing the mom and pop black-owned stores in the 70s just trying to hold on. But these were stores that thrived during segregation, but during integration, they shut down. Now, if you go to 4th Ward today, you can hardly find a black-owned business, because as soon as Washington, D.C. said that it's okay for us to go to the white-owned hotel, we forsook the black-owned hotel, and the black-owned hotel shut down. It closed down on us. So I believe that was the jewel of segregation. And me growing up in the 70s as a child of integration, I still didn't have an integrated existence. Like I said, I never spoke to a white person until I was like 17 years old. So I don't believe Jim Crow is dead. I think Jim Crow is alive and well. He just put down the bullwhip and he picked up the briefcase.
Okay, hold on now. I promised Eddie.
Words
he said it
out
for
of my
you?
mouth, except that some of us would just quote a bit different. Well, not different, but we had a few more advantages. It was always important for those who were not doctor, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. 2, we had advantages that some others didn't have, because if our parents worked in the River Oaks area, and that was one of the most richest area in the city, then you had things afforded to you that others didn't. Now, don't ask me how Mother knew Bernard Sakowitz. We'd go in Bernard Sakowitz, and she was wanting something, and he would come out and shake her hand. Abe Battlestein. They were mostly Jewish faith, who all welcomed us and did things. Levy's department store. Many of the youngsters of people sitting here can't even remember the names that I'm talking of and about. I felt that we were losing ourselves when integration came about, because we thought, as was said, we've got it. Some of us failed to bring others up by their bootstraps or let them climb on too, because they would say to you, well, they just didn't pay much attention because they had it. They were able to buy the houses. They were able to get the cars. So we were kind of left behind in view of what we had done, not so much in sittings, but what we had dealt with in this city. It was still, in my mind, as I said, it was still something burning saying, not enough. And I look at certain of us, certain of the African Americans who became the affluent. We lost the businesses. I invited someone here today whose father was a businessman. No one took hold of that person to teach him how to, the finances. So thus, many of the mom and pops lost their businesses, the places we had frequented. So we really lost a lot of what was a part of the core of this city. And for that is when I personally began to feel infuriated. Many others didn't feel. I then began to build about myself a self-esteem that says no one is better than you already. Mm-hmm. And so when I throw around the names of the Tobbs, well, I was a bit humiliated when Sam Tobb, employers of my mother, had Henry Tobb, what is that, Ben Tobb Hospital out there, had them to get me a job before I left to go to college or someplace. And I learned that with all of the skills of training that I thought I had to end up emptying bedpans. Or when I had to go to Hinkie Kroger as a college graduate then to be the first black checker. So no one knew what this mind was saying. No one really cared. And it was kind of like, that's why, as I said, when we reached the police department, you couldn't talk to some of the other people. It was no incident that Otis went where he was placed. And I used the word placed, because in trying to keep things, a lid on, keep things smooth, the day that they brought all of us, not that he was not qualified, please don't misunderstand me, because he was more than qualified. But overqualified. I agree. And I was, of course, punished for many things. But when we were brought in